My name is Steve. I work for the Ann Arbor District Library, and on behalf of the library, we'd like to welcome Dr. Ann Jeffers to the multi-purpose room to talk about her work, which is going to be available for purchase at the back after the end. And again, Can You Hear the Music? My Journey Through Madness, recounting some of her experiences going through her educational process and development process over the last 10, 15 years?
It covers a period of a year, but it's been processed over that time.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Just to go over a couple just housekeeping details. So Dr. Jeffers is going to present about her work in her book, and afterwards we'll have an opportunity for a question and answer session. One thing I do want to point out is that this is being recorded as well as live streamed. So if you do have a question, I'm going to pass around a mic when we get to a question and answer. So please use the mic so that the audience that is watching online or watching afterwards can hear the question as well as the answer. From a couple of housekeeping tips, first of all, if you are in need of hearing assisted devices, there are 2 that are sitting on the table where we came in. If you are in need of the bathroom, if you exit this room, turn right on either side of the hallway are single bathrooms, and you are welcome to use those. Without further ado, Dr. Jeffers, welcome.
All right, so thank you. I appreciate everybody coming tonight. I'd like to say a special thank you to Nami Washtenaw for advertising this event. And I'd also like to thank Fresh Start Clubhouse for advertising and bringing a couple folks here from that community as well. So I'm Ann Jeffers. I am the author of this book, Can You Hear the Music? I'm also an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. And my book tells the story of an academic, myself, who loses her mind and eventually recovers. And I'll start with just a quote from the book to sort of set the scene. It's one of the favorite sections that I wrote. And it starts as, "The Michigan winter sucked me into its abyss with its dismal charcoal days, abbreviated by a blackness that seemingly stretched on forever. The darkness, which fell like a curtain on my evening commute and sustained the absence of light until mid-morning, was suffocating. It was like being trapped deep within a pit with only the narrow beam of my van's headlights to show the way. I drove up the long gravel driveway in that unending dark, swerving around potholes as the rabbits darted in and out of view like ghosts. I pulled into the garage and took several deep breaths before entering the house." For you to be able to appreciate this book, I think it's worth talking about the genre. This book is a memoir. It is a genre of creative nonfiction that involves the storytelling of a person's real-life experience. It's not to be confused with autobiography, which is the telling of a person's entire life story. As you've probably seen, autobiography is very dry, very mechanical. There's not much color to it. Whereas with memoir, we use literary devices that are common in fiction. For example, the story has a narrative arc. The character development is the main aspect of the writing. The writer uses the principle of show, don't tell to illustrate concepts. And as a result of that, you'll see a lot of dialogue and a lot of descriptive narrative in my book. In my opinion, good memoir reads like fiction. And I aim to write this book in a style that very much reads like fiction, with a lot of dialogue, a lot of description. I focus on a very set time period. It only covers a period of about a year from 2013 to 2014. It has a good story arc. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the end, we sort of come out with some new understanding from the experience. So I focus very much on the present time. There aren't many reflections into my childhood or anything like that. It's just, what is going on right in this particular year. The crux of my story is that I have bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder that's characterized by highs and lows that are referred to as mania and depression. Most people can relate to depression because we've experienced times in our lives where our mood and our energy are sort of at a low point. Maybe this is after the loss of a job or the loss of a loved one or something like that. But mania is a little bit harder for people to relate to, and so I'll just give you an example that I encountered in my life. So on this slide here, you can see a picture of a paper that I published in 2013. The topic of the paper isn't really relevant, but one day I just woke up and I had this brilliant idea for a computational model, and I was going to derive this computational model and run some simulations, get some results, and get a paper out of this, okay? And as an academic, that's not too far-fetched for me to get an idea and try to write a paper about it. But what was unique about this is that I worked around the clock, and within a week, I had derived the mathematical formulation, I wrote the computer code, I implemented the formulation into commercial software, I ran simulations, and I drafted a 20-page plus manuscript that I submitted for publication in a prestigious journal, and it was accepted with only minor revisions. Now, keep in mind that I did all of this in the same week that I taught my classes, and I met with my students, and I wrote reports to funding agencies. And oh, by the way, I also painted my bedroom and rearranged my furniture. So as you can see, when I'm manic, I have this intense energy. And at some points in my life, it has actually led to significant career successes, as we saw on this slide here. But mania is not always enjoyable, and if you read my book, you're going to see that there are some very dark sides to having that mania, one of the worst being that I also experienced symptoms of psychosis, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So in this presentation, what I want to do is just give you some background information to give you greater context and an appreciation for the story that I tell. It's not my intent to give you any spoilers. I don't want to tell you the story that's in the book because I want you to read it and I want you to appreciate it for what it is. But I will say that it can be an emotionally difficult read. I do not shy away from topics like psychosis and suicidal ideation and trauma. But while it's a difficult book to read, it is ultimately a story of hope. I'm standing here today and I'm telling you, that I lived through this, and I am in a better place now than where I was in 2014. So I've had symptoms of bipolar disorder my entire life. It went untreated until 2013 when I received my diagnosis. I'll tell you a little bit about my childhood so that you can get some appreciation for what it was like growing up with bipolar disorder while being undiagnosed. So I was born in the early 80s. I'm a zennial, like at the cusp between Gen X and millennial. And I had an idyllic childhood. My mom was a stay-at-home mom with me and my two brothers. And most of my childhood was spent playing on our 2-acre lot in southwestern Pennsylvania. My parents were high school sweethearts. They never argued in front of us. They loved us unconditionally, and they impressed upon us the importance of hard work and education. In my mind, they were the model parents. I was always sensitive, and somewhere around 3rd or 4th grade, I began to experience feelings of melancholy. I would be overcome with a deep sadness, even to the point of crying, at times when I believed I should have been happy. I never told my parents about it, or anybody for that matter. It was just a part of who I was. And I had no reason to be sad, so I just pushed those feelings aside. The mania became apparent as I reached adolescence. My first manic hallucination happened when I was around the age of 13 years old, and I can remember it perfectly. It was a beautiful summer day. I was at summer camp. I was laying in the grass. I was looking up at the sky, and I was absolutely euphoric. And all of a sudden, this line formed across the sky that was a line between dark and light. And it just moved across the sky like a shade, really slow moving, and it came down, and then, boom, it was nighttime. And it was the most incredible thing I had ever seen. It was so bizarre, and yet it was so beautiful. And I wished I could share it with other people. But there was something in the back of my head that said, there's something that's not quite right about this. Like, I can't come up with a physical explanation for what it is that I'm experiencing. And so I kept it to myself. I never told anybody about it. But that was the first hallucination that I can remember. Now, as I got a little bit older, as a teenager, my family and we lived in Germany for a couple years. And during that time period, I started experimenting with alcohol. I started sneaking out of my bedroom at night and wandering into town or wandering around the apple orchards behind our home. There's an essay that I wrote and published in Open Minds Quarterly called First Brush with Psychosis, where I wander into town and I go into the bar and get a beer at the bar. And, and then I start having sort of these symptoms of paranoia and whatnot. I kept on. My parents never knew anything of this. And when I published that article, I sent it to my mom first, and she's like, "Oh my God, I didn't know you did that." After I returned to the States, I was about 14, 15 years old. I got in with the party crowd. I started drinking at any chance I could get and even experimenting with drugs. I would do basically anything to numb the sadness that had become a part of my everyday experience. In the field of mental health, this is called self-medicating. I was a reckless teenager. I drove recklessly at high speeds, sometimes on the wrong side of the road, sometimes while under the influence. And only my friends knew about this. Anne's a little crazy, but whatever. So through it all, I excelled academically, right? I'm a professor. I got a PhD. Like, I'm a really intelligent person. And while this was all going on, while I was partying and drinking and doing drugs and whatever, I made a point that I would not party on a school night, and I would do my homework, and I would get everything submitted. And straight A student, and you can see here that I received numerous awards for my academics. Let's see. So at the age of 19, I met Susan, who is pictured on the left there. And Susan is my partner and now wife. We navigated college and grad school together, and we had many great adventures and shared countless laughs. I struggled with coming out during that time. This was in the early 2000s, so being queer wasn't totally acceptable. But we managed to make it through. And after Susan and I moved to Michigan, I became much more open about my relationship with her, and we welcomed our first child into the world. Now, I continued to experience these ups and downs in mood throughout grad school, throughout college and throughout grad school. I continued to be very serious about my studies. And in fact, once I got into college, I was very serious about my studies. And then when I got to grad school, I became very, very serious about my studies. And I basically obsessed over everything, and I was a perfectionist, and I did really well as a result of that. However, while I was in grad school, the trauma of 3 violent incidents on campus had a cumulative effect on my well-being. Most people remember in 2007 there was a shooting at Virginia Tech. Many people probably don't remember that in 2006 there was a prisoner who escaped near campus and killed a police officer and a security guard at the hospital. Most people probably also don't remember that in 2009 there was a man who brutally killed a student in a coffee shop on campus. While I didn't witness any of these events firsthand, they happened in spaces that I frequented. I watched the events unfold on the news. With regards to the shooting, my department lost several students and a faculty member. I didn't know any of them personally, but I attended their memorial services and I grieved for my community's loss. I did experience paranoia and nightmares following the shooting. Many of us did, but I never sought any treatment for it because I didn't feel that I was entitled to any sort of help. There were so many who had experienced so much worse than I had. I wasn't even on campus the day that those things happened. So I buried that trauma just as I buried my bipolar symptoms. Immediately after grad school, I took a tenure track position at the University of Michigan. This was in 2009. And I've been here ever since. I maintained my fear of classrooms and other public spaces, but I talked my way through the anxiety. I had many successes during those early years, and I published a number of papers, secured over $1 million in research funding, and received numerous awards for my teaching, research, and service. While I was experiencing mood episodes during that period of time, I buried everything and I just focused on my work. However, things sort of came to a head in 2013. My wife and I were trying to get pregnant at that time with a second child, and I was seeking fertility treatments, and the stress of that whole process sent my moods all over the place, and I started experiencing symptoms of psychosis. So my mood swings became more pronounced. I started having auditory and visual hallucinations. I had post-traumatic stress flashbacks, which is kind of an odd thing to think that I could have a flashback of something that I've never actually witnessed in real life. But I would have these flashes of these horrible images. I was severely paranoid all the time, and I had delusional thoughts off and on. I pushed my way through the symptoms, but the experience was quite scary and incredibly isolating. Keep in mind that I never disclosed to my employer that I had mental illness. I never told anybody at work, okay? I dealt with this quietly with my therapist and my psychiatrist. And they advised me not to tell the university because I was pre-tenure and I could lose my job as a result of this if it came out that I was, quote, crazy. So, I started giving talks about mental health. And I always show this slide here, right? So this is sort of summarizing where I've been, right? So I got my bachelor's degree in 2004 from the University of Pittsburgh, my master's and PhD from Virginia Tech. Then I came straight here, got a tenure track position at the University of Michigan. Within 6 years, I was promoted to associate professor, and that's where I currently sit at the university. And when I show this to people, I say, look at this. This is the career of somebody who's incredibly successful. This is not the career of somebody who lost her mind, started seeing and hearing things that were not really there. How on earth did that even happen, right? And so this is what I would like to post as my CV, right? Which is that, actually when I was doing my PhD work, there was the shooting and these other traumas, and I had to carry that with me. And, when I was on the tenure track, I was diagnosed with bipolar I disorder and had to navigate that without letting my employer know, without taking a leave of absence. And then, in 2015 onward, I was associate professor, but guess what? My wife and I, because we couldn't get pregnant, we decided to become foster parents, and we fostered several children, ended up adopting 2 of them, right? And so that's where we currently sit. It's a happy story, but, there's a lot going on here. And so the takeaway here is that, you don't know what a person is dealing with in their personal life, right? If you just look at sort of how they're doing in their career or how they look on Facebook or Instagram or wherever, there could be a lot more going on. Okay, so that brings me to the book. So as part of my recovery, I wrote a book about the experience, which is entitled, Can You Hear the Music? My Journey Through Madness. And I wrote this book because I needed to make sense of the things that I had experienced. I needed to express my thoughts on paper, and I needed to close that chapter of my life and to just move on. I went through all this stuff, but here I am, and I'm a different person now than when I was 10 years ago. And while I was ill, I read many mental health memoirs, but I found that the experiences of other authors were so much milder than anything that I had experienced. And so I resolved to document my experience to help others who find themselves in similar situations. I started this as sort of a manic project. I was like, I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to become famous, and it's going to be amazing, and I'm going to be a New York Times bestseller, and whatever. And then I said, wait a minute, I need a reality check. So I sent that chapter to my therapist, and I said, am I on to anything? And she said, this is really good. I encourage you to just keep writing. People could really benefit from this. And so with her blessing, I guess, I, over several years, wrote this book that now is in front of us. And I will say that my book contains some triggering materials. Obviously, I talk about the Virginia Tech shooting and some of this other stuff, and I talk about my symptoms of psychosis, and I talk about suicidal ideation. But I really do believe that those who are affected by mental illness can learn some things about the harsh realities of having mental illness that are not covered anywhere else. I couldn't find it, and so that's why I wrote this book. And I like this quote by Sylvia Plath, which says, "I write only because there is a voice within me that will not be stilled." And for me, this voice was nagging, and it said, you have to write this down. You've got an incredible story. You've got to write it. And so I did. And just a side note, that Sylvia Plath is an author that I can relate to because she also experienced mental illness. And her book, The Bell Jar, was one of the books that I was reading during that time period to try to understand what it's like to have serious mental illness. And if you know anything about me, I'm an engineer and I like data. And so, goodness, when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I said, I'm going to keep a mood chart. And I logged every single day for a year where my moods were, what my levels of anxiety were, whether I was having symptoms of psychosis, what medications I was taking, all that stuff. And then I kept a journal on the side. And I would document how I was feeling that day, what happened, whatever. So I had all this data, and I was like, this is perfect for writing a book. Like, I did all the research, even though I didn't know that I was doing it. And so I like to think of my book as a research study itself with n equals 1. So the sample size being 1, me, but it is a research study, and maybe that's why my colleagues up on North Campus can appreciate the work that I've done here. And I'll tell you a little bit about my writing process. The book is something that I worked on over several years, right? This is the time period is exactly 10 years to the day, right? So over this period of 10 years, I was writing, and off and on, then eventually edited and published it. And the writing process, obviously this is not my day job, writing books. My day job is I'm a professor of engineering at the University of Michigan. And so I would write, in the wee hours of the morning, drinking my coffee on my phone. I'd write, some paragraphs here and paragraphs there and whatever. And then I got pretty serious about it. I said, okay, I need to move it off of this Google Doc into a Word doc on a laptop and, finish this out. And so just between breaks and, the summer and whatever, I found enough time to put everything together and to make it coherent. I invested heavily in editing because I wanted this to be the highest quality book that I could produce. And then in 2023, I decided that I was going to start querying and try to find an agent to publish the book. And I very quickly switched gears. And what prompted me to switch gears was that I was invited to give a talk at a scientific conference. It's the top conference in my field, a top international conference. And they were inviting me to speak on my experience with having mental illness. And I said, you know what? I don't need to traditionally publish this book. I can self-publish it. I just need to get it out there, and then, it's there. And if people want to read it, they can read it. But, at the end of the day, that's really what I want to do. And so that's why I switched gears and decided to self-publish the book. Okay, so we're good on time. I want to read to you an excerpt from the book. This is my favorite chapter. It is short. But I guess I'll sort of preface this by saying, this book covers a period of a year where there are lots of ups and lots of downs. And this is one of the lowest lows. And so I'll read this to you, and you can sit with it for a minute. It's called The Weight of Depression. This takes place in August 2014. Interestingly, my moods tend to be opposite of what the weather is. So most of my weird mania stuff spikes in the winter, and then the summers are very depressing times for me, and I'm not sure why that is the case. It's probably the rhythm of the academic year, if I had to guess. Okay. Despite the shining afternoon sun, I donned a cloak made of lead. It slowed my movements and covered me in darkness, its opaque surface preventing any light from illuminating my world within. It wasn't long before the weight of the cloak dragged me to the floor. As my body slid from my chair, I scrambled to reach for something to hold on to, my red Columbia fleece. I balled it up under my head, a pillow to break my descent to the cold concrete. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, but I could not sleep. I wanted to sleep. I needed to sleep. If only I could wash away the sickness, a drink of cold water, a breath of fresh air, a much-needed slumber, anything to bring life to my wasted body. But instead, I lay on the floor of my office, door locked, lights dimmed, praying no one would disturb my rest. The buses growled with their coming and going from the bus stop outside my window. The noise was relentless. The sounds that came from the fabrication shop below, the clank, bang, and zhree, were unsettling. It was as if the circular saw buzzed through my stillness and the hammer shattered my quietude. If only I could have slept. If only I could have slept. Snap out of it. The cardinal outside my window taunted me with his incessant chirping. His cheerfulness tormented me, as if to say, "Look how unalive you are, you pathetic, miserable soul." With his bright coat of feathers and his quick tilt of his head, he pecked at the window curiously. Disgusted, I rolled away from the window to face the underside of my desk. The desk was worn from its decades of service, its metal was chipped and bent in various places, and its beige paint was smattered with brown stains and sticky outlines of masking tape that had randomly been applied to its surfaces. The desk reminded me of myself, pathetic, lifeless, no longer needed. Get up. But I could not rise. My pleas were hopeless. Every ounce of strength had been sucked from my veins. All that was left was the carcass on the floor of my office. I could already smell the meat beginning to rot. I waited patiently for the vultures to come and pick at my fragile remains. It would not be long before I would decompose to a fine powder that would be swept away in a gentle and lively breeze. This must be what death feels like. No, death would have been better than this, better than suffering through such a dreadful existence. I pondered death, but decided the energy required to devise a plan and carry it out was actually beyond my ability in my crippled state. Instead, I sighed and rolled back toward the window. The ghastly cardinal had flown away, leaving a peaceful scene before me. The pines swayed in the breeze, causing the light to glisten in my eyes. I lusted for the sun, whose golden rays beckoned like the Lorelei, the fabled woman whose beauty and song drew the attention of sailors, causing their ships to crash onto the rocks. I felt my body lifting from the floor, my arms stretched towards the sun, my mind so numb that it was incapable of feeling my skin scorching as I neared the sun's surface. Burnt hair, melted skin. When I pulled my hands back, there was nothing but charcoal for my appendages. The burns left a blackness that perfectly matched the blackness of my mind and heart. As I fantasized about being destroyed by the sun, I realized that I dreamt of something more than death, a death that was deader than death, because it was the only way to stop the sickening feeling that plagued my body and mind. I could not see my family. I could not see life. Death was the only way. And because I couldn't die enough, I needed to sleep. If I could sleep, I knew at least that someday, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but someday my mood would change and I would be able to see the world in color again. Hold on, Anne. Go to sleep. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and prayed for time to pass. So what I like about that passage is that it shows sort of the distortion of thoughts that come with depression. I also like that it shows my survival strategy, right? Which is, okay, things are really, really bad right now. I'm just going to go to sleep, and I'm going to sleep through this because I know I've got bipolar disorder. It's rapid cycling, and I know in a few days I'm not going to be feeling this depression anymore. That's that. I do want to mention just briefly, real quick, that suicidal ideation is nothing to really gloss over, and that's why I do try to address it in my book. Nearly as many as 20% of people with bipolar disorder lose their life to suicide, and as many as 50 or 60%, I mean, the statistics vary based on where you read them from, but 50 to 60% of people with bipolar disorder are believed to attempt suicide in their lifetime. So it's an incredibly life-threatening illness. And I think we need to talk about that. And I think we need to talk about treatment, and I think we need to understand that treatment in many cases can be very helpful. For me, it took from switching from lamictal to lithium, and then the suicidal thoughts disappeared, and so I think that that is worth discussing. Okay, now in my book, there are several other themes that come to light, and I'll just talk about these briefly. Let me ask the question, how many of you have seen the movie The Shining? Most people have, yeah. Or any horror movie where some crazy person loses their mind and then becomes extremely violent and whatever. That is not the reality of having mental illness, right? That is not the reality of experiencing psychosis. And so when I was diagnosed in the very first chapter in the book, when I received this diagnosis of bipolar disorder with psychotic features, the word psychotic it drew up all these awful images because that is what I've been trained to understand and think of when I think of the word psychotic or psychosis. So, and I think that that was one of the biggest barriers to me succeeding in treatment, was that I held this stigma and I kept beating myself up every time I would experience a hallucination or whatever. Oh, you're crazy, you're losing your mind, like you should just give up. And that is not the case. And so my understanding at this point in time is that there's really no shame in experiencing psychosis. It is literally just the symptoms of an illness, just like the fever is a symptom that you have the flu or something, And so the way that I deal with it now is that if I start experiencing symptoms of psychosis, I don't freak out. I just tell my doctor and we adjust the medications and everything's fine. So like it's really not nearly as big of a deal as what I thought. Another theme that comes out in the book deals with the symptoms of mental illness. And I will just mention again that I was actively symptomatic when I had to go to work and pretend that everything was okay. I was still teaching my classes. I was still meeting with students and advising them in research and whatnot. And the symptoms that I did experience included not just mania and depression, but also psychosis, severe anxiety, suicidal ideation, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. And it was an incredibly horrible time. And so, I think having some sense of understanding about sort of like the harshness of mental illness, I think is an important message that comes from my book. I've mentioned alcohol and drugs already. I will just state that there was a national comorbidity study that found that 51% of the people who had a substance disorder at some time in their life also met the criteria for having a mental disorder at some point in their life. And in most cases, the mental illness or the mental disorder preceded the use of the substances. And so there is a large number of people in this country who have serious mental illness who are also battling substance use issues and things like that. And I will say that for me, I still struggle with alcohol use today and trying to keep that regulated. Related to the Virginia Tech stuff, there's a lot of stuff in my book about trauma. And there, I mentioned that I had nightmares and anxiety ever since the shooting, but I sort of buried that away. And what happened was in the winter of 2014, during this horrible time, a student came into my classroom and sat down. Now, to any normal person, you'd think there's really no harm in that, right? You're teaching a class full of students, and students come and go, and what's the deal? But in my mind, I thought I was in danger, and I had to end class abruptly. And that is a scene that is in the book. But ever since that incident in 2014, my stress and anxiety and my fear of the classroom became so heightened, and part of it was like, entangled with the psychosis and the paranoia and all of that. Part of it is related to the trauma, but that whole year was a perfect nightmare, in my opinion. And so the takeaway with this is that mass trauma is something that is incredibly widespread, especially in America, especially in today, especially with the gun violence in the US and whatnot. And I will just say that being on the other side of dealing with all of this, it's important to recognize that an individual does not have to directly experience the violence in order to have post-traumatic stress symptoms, right? You don't have to qualify for having the disorder from the DSM manual in order to get help, right? If you're having those symptoms are valid, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. And so, there's a class at the University of Michigan in the field of nursing on behavioral health, and the instructor invites me to come speak every semester. And I share my story, and we talk about trauma, and I sort of drive this home. But this is sort of like a really important point, is that you don't have to have a diagnosis in order to go to therapy and get help. And then this last one is sort of related to like the modes of treatment, right? So like for bipolar disorder, the common treatment is to take medications and go to therapy. And those are two big staples of my diet these days. I guess I go to therapy weekly. I take all my medications very much as prescribed. And the thing that I think I would like to point out is that what most people don't understand is that the treatment with medications is not a straightforward process. Psychiatry is not a direct science, right? It's very much based on trial and error. And what works for my body is not going to work for your body. And what works for my body now might not work for my body 10 years from now. It's like your body's always changing, and the medications lose effectiveness, and things are complicated. And so I did not know going into this that I would have to take 6 to 8 different antipsychotic medications before finding one that actually curbed the psychosis, right? And each one of those medications I was on for several weeks. There were side effects. Everything, right? So I think learning that it takes a year or more to actually stabilize from something like this is something that needs to be more widely publicized. And so that is another message that I like to get out. Okay, so we'll wrap this up. So at the end of the day, I made it through tenure, right? I'm tenured at the University of Michigan, and you have to keep in mind that, yes, I had a really bad year, but I had many good years before that. Good in the sense that I was academically productive, not good in the sense that I was undiagnosed bipolar and, painting my bedroom and writing papers and doing all kinds of stuff that, were probably not normal. But I made it. And the reality is that because I masked my symptoms, I hid it so well, I ended up burning out, and I had to step down from some pretty significant responsibilities and to focus on myself for a few years, and that included, adopting a couple kids and whatnot. As a result, there is a gap in my research career, and we were talking about this before this presentation started, but I used to do work on structures in fire. Then there was a gap in my research, and now I'm moving into wildfires. Some might think, well, that's a really strategic career move, but it's also partly because I had to start over from somewhere, and so why not do something cool like wildfires? And what recovery looks like for me is that I take medications and therapy regularly. I prioritize sleep like you would not believe. I try to keep stress low and acknowledge my limits, although it's kind of hard when you have 3 kids to keep stress low, especially my kids. And then, carefully planning my travel. So I made a trip to Japan in October to give this talk on mental health to this fire science conference. And I was very, very worried that was going to set me off. That combined with the book launch, right? And so I was in very close contact with my team, and making sure that I was getting sleep and things like that. And I made it, right? And that to me is a success. And then also just setting boundaries between work and home, which I'm terrible at doing. So, you forget it. All right, and then I always sort of like to show this slide because not everybody in this room has mental illness. And so I like to distinguish between mental health and mental illness. This is an image that was taken from the School of Mental Health in Ontario website. Regardless, what I want to show here is that on the horizontal axis, we see, you could have severe mental illness on the left, or you could have no mental illness on the right. Some people have mild mental illness, whatever. You could be anywhere on that horizontal continuum. But the axis to focus on is, good mental health versus poor mental health. And so just to sort of illustrate, maybe in the time of the book, I was down in the lower left quadrant with poor mental health with mental illness, right? I was in a really bad state and really needed a lot of help and a lot of time and a lot of support, right? And then over time, I was able to move into the good mental health with mental illness, right? So I still have mental illness. I still have bipolar disorder. I'm always going to have it. And there's no, I just have to manage it just like I would if I had high blood pressure or something. Okay, but I can have good mental health. I can prioritize sleep. I can try to curb the alcohol, and do what I can to reduce stress and things like that. And for those folks who are on sort of like the no mental illness side of things, mental health is still important, right? Because if you're in a period of high stress and things are so, challenging, you can push yourself down into that poor mental health category and start to experience things like symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, and things like that. So I'm sort of advocating for everybody to move up into the good mental health areas. All right, so with that said, we'll wrap things up. This is my book, and I have some for sale today if you are interested in buying. I prefer credit card because it's cleaner than cash and just financially keeping things in order because I own a business and I've got to report to the IRS and stuff. But this is an indie book, right? I'm an indie author, and so anything you can do to support this book and whatever is much appreciated, including, if you like the book, leave a review wherever you leave reviews. I would like to acknowledge my publisher, Mad Engineer Press, LLC, which is just me, honestly. But I have an LLC, it's official. And then, the editors and proofreaders and cover designer who I hired, but they're fantastic people and they did a wonderful job. I do want to mention this, since this was advertised by NAMI, that I have grand visions for Mad Engineer Press, right? Like if it were to actually get successful and I could actually pay off my debts enough and get enough of a pot of money, I would like to support other authors who have mental illness who want to get their story published. So just keep that in mind. A few years down the road, you may see another book come out from Mad Engineer Press. Another thing that I'd like to advertise, since this is the library, is the Emerging Writers meetups, which happen over at the Westgate branch. I actually attended a couple of these as I was writing my book, and they're really fantastic. It's a great way to get feedback if you're writing something, so just, if you have an inkling to do some writing, whether it's memoir or some other thing, check them out. And then lastly, I'll just leave this slide up here. That's how you can find me. And Brood Awakenings in Celine, so far, is the only place that I know of that has my book in stock on a shelf. So all right, I'm happy to take questions.
And as a quick reminder, if you do have questions, raise your hand and I'll be happy to bring you the mic. Thank you for going first.
Sure. So you shared that writing this was sort of just a thing you had to get out of your system, right? Do you feel like you were successful in that? Do you think you...
Absolutely, yeah. No, I feel great. And it's great being able to talk about these things and to I don't feel the shame and I don't feel the stigma that I used to feel. So it's sort of liberating to be able to have it. It's published, it's out there, and the feedback has been so positive. People love this book, and colleagues on campus are saying, "Wow, this is great stuff, So like it's all around been a really good experience. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Did it take a while for you to find a psychiatrist that could really help you?
So psychiatry is a really challenging profession. Folks work weird hours, and there's a lot of turnover. So my understanding, just at first glance, is that it's probably not the best medical profession to work in, and probably not the most respected medical profession, and therefore it's hard to find good doctors. And so I started out with a therapist. And the clinic was one where they provided therapy and psychiatry, so I started seeing their psychiatrists. And I went through, in the span of a year, I went through maybe 4 or 5 different psychiatrists because they just kept leaving. And so in the book, there's just Dr. Park, the psychiatrist, but Dr. Park was actually 4 different people, and they all had a different approach to psychiatry. And one would put me on one thing, another would put me on another, and so like it was sort of frustrating for me. I did end up getting a really good psychiatrist through that practice. He left, and then I got another really good psychiatrist through that practice, and I still have her today, even though like the practice went bankrupt, I think, and so again, not a great place to work, but so. It's hard. It's hard to find good doctors, and I deal with the same stuff with my kids as well. I've got a kid who needs to see a psychiatrist, and we've been bounced around a couple times and whatever, and I think there's a lot of advocating that you need to do for yourself, right? So I'll give you an example. One of the psychiatrists, I only saw her once, and then I said I'm not going back to her. But I went in there, and I was still having hallucinations, hearing music, but I went into her office telling her that the side effects were too much, like the medicine's too sedating. I don't feel like myself, and I wanted her to come down on the dose, and then she said, well, we don't want you hearing music, and she increased my dose, and that was like totally the opposite of what I wanted to do, and so I got out of her and, got put in with somebody else, but so like it's hard. I guess it's with any medical profession. There are good doctors and bad doctors, but it seems like the good psychiatrists are hard to find, and you really have to be patient. I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful speech, and also for a person who has bipolar, it's one of those things that treatment is more or less personalized. My treatment is different from hers, and that includes things like medication stuff, where I work with my medical team, and it's like, okay, you're well enough that you don't need medication, at least for that stuff. There's other stuff I need for it, but that's another story. And you won't believe how many times that different medical stuff, even at the PS or at the hospital, where they look at the textbook, oh, you're bipolar? Here's all the medication you need. What? Why do I need medication when my doctor doesn't say I need medication? Because the textbook says so. So it's time to work through that. Then there's also all the headache of finding the right doctors and stuff, because a lot of times, here's a book of doctors and stuff that you have. It's like 500 pages, and you have to go through to figure out which company does Medicaid, insurance pays for and stuff. So it gets exhausting. That's when you find good friends who happens to be a psychiatrist, and they're good support over the years.
Yeah, it is. It's challenging. It's challenging to find the right medications. It's challenging to find the right doctors. It's challenging to find the right therapists, and you have to be persistent. And that process is exhausting. My kids, have various conditions, and we're forever just, advocating and pushing, trying to get the IEPs and all that stuff, and there's just a lot to it. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not specific to mental illness, but I do think there are it's maybe a little bit extra challenging with mental illness to find a good provider.
I don't know who is. We'll start and move our way back.
Thank you so much, Professor Jeffers. I was wondering have you found it challenging to be so vulnerable and open about your mental illness struggles, especially in the academic setting where we don't usually talk about it, unfortunately?
Yeah, so I basically said, I got tenure at the University of Michigan. My job is protected. I have privilege that most folks don't have, right? Most people could be fired by their employer. And not have any recourse. And so by having that protection, I feel like I have an obligation to share my story. And I don't hold back, and there's some parts in that book where I'm just like super cringy, like when I read it, because, I'm like, I can't believe I put this in writing, but it's there because it happened and it's important to the story. And so, I think, and maybe this is related to my own identities, right? Me being a queer woman in engineering, me having kids who are multiracial, me having kids who are adopted, me having kids who have, various disabilities and whatnot. It's just part of who I am, right? Is to do the right thing and to, stand up and mentor people and support people and whatever. So like, it's excuse me, it's hard, but it's a struggle that I feel obligated to take on. Yeah. And people have been largely supportive as a result. Like, so I don't have any regrets.
Hi, Dr. Jeffers. My comment was also about academia and how academia can often feel like such a daunting career to be in, or even like, a student in it, because it's so performance-based. So I'm wondering, has your story helped you change how you approach teaching? Do you feel like you're better at communicating to students, like including the students who don't have those diagnoses? Because of course we know that they're out there. What's your experience like in academia? Do you think you're better because of your story as an educator, as a connector to people?
Totally. Yeah. So I have turned my experience into advocacy work, and that also includes on the university campus, right? And I'm a more compassionate teacher. I am more in tune with folks with disabilities in general, and trying to not just accommodate, but to speak up for and advocate for folks who sort of get pushed aside. And so, yeah, I think this has made me a better educator, and I think I've made my colleagues better, because I've brought attention to things that they maybe weren't so in tune with, So, I'm happy with where I am with that I was able to take lemons and turn it into lemonade, I guess.
Thank you for being here and for your vulnerability. I have two questions that are sort of in the same vein, actually. One is, students may know this about you now that it's, more public. Do you find that that's something that comes up, that students that you work with or mentor are more comfortable talking to you about their own struggles than they may be other instructors? Does that ever come up in conversations, like if they need time for their own things? I think it's in the same vein of this connection. Are you someone that they see as more approachable, or like to have those conversations with?
Yeah, in 2019, I gave a talk in my department, Lessons on Mental Health from a Professor with Mental Illness, right? So that was sort of my coming out to my department. And I focus more on student well-being and, the literature, as opposed to telling too much of my story, but I did share a little bit. And I think that there have been students who've come to me as a result of me being somebody who's just open and understanding. And I think that is probably a good thing. And the other thing I've noticed is that there are some colleagues on campus. Now, it's always sort of hush-hush. It's like, oh, by the way, I take an antidepressant too, or something, like, or I go to therapy, but so I think, like, academia is hurting for us to open up about this, right? And so that's why I think, like, now is the time for this book to be published, and I think now is the time to be having these conversations. Post-pandemic, the rates of depression and anxiety in students is, like, through the roof. Probably the same for faculty, probably the same for staff, so, like, we need to be having these conversations, and if I have to be the one to start it, then so be it, so.
I am a staff member at the university, so that's sort of where that came from. And then you actually touched on this. I was curious if you could talk more about what that was like, shifting from, hiding that about yourself to speaking about it at a conference, and just like how did it become something you felt comfortable sharing? Was it after you had tenure, or just like, can you talk a little bit more about that journey?
Yeah, it was after I had tenure. I think in 2018, I started to really become open about it. And actually where it all started, part of my recovery was the volunteer work that I did at Fresh Start Clubhouse. Basically, I'm one who tries to make sense of things through volunteering. I've always been, service has always been important to me since I was a kid. And so, I was teaching computer literacy classes to folks, who had no background in using computers. And, just being around other people with mental illness was sort of helped with the recovery. It made it easier to talk about things and to sort of come to grips with some of the things that I was dealing with. Because like I said, one of my biggest barriers was that internalized stigma. And so being able to overcome that, being able to see other people who are dealing with similar things, and seeing that they're just people, they're just dealing with a challenging condition, and so through that I think I came to terms with everything, obviously still in therapy, got tenure, and then it was like, okay, well, the next step would be for me to speak out. I'm protected in my job. And I did have some reservations because academia is conservative. Engineering is even more so conservative, right? Like as a field, in terms of the types of things that they accept and whatnot. And I wasn't sure how my colleagues on North Campus were going to take this. But everybody was overwhelmingly positive, and it sort of gave me the reassurance that I needed in order to keep going with this.